Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Transnational Feminism, Solidarity, and Social Justice lecture series. Thank you all for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Tatsiana Shchurko from the Ohio State University. She'll give a talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have some time for discussion. But before we move on to her lecture, I would like to share a few words of introduction and some technical notes as well. Transnational Feminism, Solidarity, and Social Justice, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is a new project funded by the Open Society University Network. So the project brings together faculty and students from various Oslo colleges and universities across the world to jointly develop network collaborative courses, as well as research and art projects and other activities that acknowledge the importance of transnational feminism as a toolkit for social justice. My name is Agata Wisiak. I'm the leader of this project and associate professor at Bard College, Berlin. I would now like to pass it on to my awesome colleague, Dr. Mahira Suyarkulova, who will first introduce Dr. Shchurko and later moderate the discussion. Mahira is a queer feminist activist and associate professor in the psychology department at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek. She's published widely in academic outlets and way beyond those. I'll just mention one of her recent publications, which she co-authored with Nina Bagdasarova and Georgi Mamedov, and which is titled, has this fantastic title. It's titled Book on Happiness for Young and Not So Young LGBT, but Not Only People. So thank you, Mahira, for co-hosting today's event.
Thank you, Agata. And thanks to all who have joined us tonight. Hope everyone can hear me well. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, colleague, and comrade, Dr. Tatsiana Shchurko. Tatsiana and I met many years ago in 2014. Today I was reconstructing and I found this zine that was the result of a collaborative project between Belarusian queer feminist activist initiatives and an institution in Bishkek called Shtab, School of Theory and Activism Bishkek. So Tatsiana and another activist, Anna Laktionova, came to Bishkek and conducted a wonderful series of lectures and workshops. And as a result of their stay in Bishkek, we created this zine, queer feminist zine. And this started a really long-term kind of relationship between many people across countries. So I think it's a great example of transnational feminist solidarity. And so Tatsiana is really a great example of, bridging the world of activism with the world of academia. She's a researcher and a queer feminist activist from Belarus. And last year, she completed her PhD in the Department of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Ohio State University. And her dissertation explores hidden or unclaimed histories of socialist internationalism and their relevance today. So she will be talking more about her work in her talk today. So without further ado, I will just give the floor to Tatsiana, and she will talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm really looking forward. Tatsiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mahira, very much for such a kind and warm introduction. I think, yeah, our collaboration was great for creating more collaborations and relations, and it's also a very significant part of my research as well, in terms of methodology and approaches. And I also want to thank organizers, Mahira and Agata, as well, for inviting me and for your interest in my work. So I'm very happy to share some parts of my research. I will share a screen. I have a presentation that maybe will help to provide a visual aid for my research. So my talk today relies on my dissertation project that focuses, as Mahira said, on histories of socialist internationalism. In the description to this event, I included the comment by Esther Cooper Jackson, the renowned Black civil rights activist, social worker, and leftist thinker. In 2006, she underlined at a community event in Harlem that, quote, more and more of us need to become internationalists, end quote, by getting involved in struggles worldwide and making ties with oppressed peoples. As a queer feminist activist from Belarus, I reflect on Cooper Jackson's statement and feel the urgency of her message for transnational organizing and solidarity today. How might transnational feminists draw upon the histories of Black feminist internationalism to both understand and respond to multiple imperialisms and connect across differences and distant geographies? Today, many past solidarities associated with socialist internationalism or Black feminist internationalism have been excluded from transnational feminist inquiry and devalued. However, our current ongoing context of the pandemic, rise of the global right, imperial violence, colonial warfare, and authoritarian politics make obvious the transnational interdependencies and raise concerns about the possibilities of feminist solidarity and care between distant communities. At the same time, the predominance of Western liberal feminist epistemologies, together with unattended imperial relations within the former Soviet region, affect why post-Soviet feminist scholarship often ignores how the complex interplay of ethnicity, racialization, class, and gender operates in the former Second World, thus perpetuating Eurocentrism, Russocentrism, or ethnocentrism, and neglecting experiences of non-white, non-Slavic, non-European women in the region. In the US, so-called zombie McCarthyism, keeping alive the memory of anti-communist purges at the beginning and mid-century, pushed many scholars and activists to detach anti-imperialist and anti-racist political action from anti-capitalist agendas and histories. Not only the socialist feminism in the US increasingly broke ties with East European or Eurasian genealogies, but much of feminist scholarship started to neglect socialist orientations of many past anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles and movements. However, some intellectuals today strive to return to this link and ensure the accuracy of archive. I mean, for example, Carol Boyce Davis, Eric McDuffie, Barbara Rainsby, or Kianga Yamata Taylor. Yet, even in this scholarship, the link between past radical struggles in the US and the former Second World is not strongly drawn about. To approach the contemporary urgencies, I look at the link between past radical struggles in the US and the former Second World. In this way, I focus on alternative geographies of connection, togetherness, and solidarity that appear marginal, insignificant, or invisible for conventional historiographies and traditional geographic arrangements. At the same time, I suggest problematizing also who speaks for a post-Soviet subject, and hence how routes of transnational feminist solidarity can be delineated. My methodological approach to these past histories relies heavily on my personal story and journey of how and why I decided to explore the histories of socialist internationalism. My research exploration started with thinking about the place where I was born. I grew up in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, in a district full of places named in honor of Soviet internationalism and socialist solidarity. For many years, I moved across and around, for example, Bangalore Square in my neighborhood. In my neighborhood without any idea or clue to what this place name referred. The names were just part of my quotidian life and the backdrop to childhood and adolescence dominated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, intense social and economic turmoil, and the establishment of authoritarian regime. I only just recently learned that Bangalore Square was named as such in 1986 to commemorate friendship between Bangalore in India and Minsk in Belarus. As sister cities, there is a square in Bangalore. While honoring in the Soviet relations, Bangalore Square also appears as a symbol of socialist internationalism, which was theorized and practiced as an important part of a collective struggle against capitalism and imperialism. Unfortunately, Bangalore Square's internationalist impulse did not lead to community engagement during the Soviet period and now is mostly neglected by the post-Cold War geopolitical imaginary. This sister city solidarity between Bangalore and Minsk took place within the context of the Cold War when the West and the Eastern Bloc sought to secure the geopolitical spheres of influence. As part of that geopolitical struggle, the Soviet Union forged alliances with the global South. Yet these alliances were often performative and emerged in the pursuit of geopolitical interests. The corrupt nature of many state-sanctioned internationalist practices, together with Soviet Eurocentric and Russocentric imperialist politics, often made such solidarities with the global South not appealing to Eastern European communities. Perhaps because of the disingenuous nature of many solidarity links, the meaning of Bangalore Square, though symbolic of socialist internationalism, was never central to local people's understanding of their place and function within internationalist praxis. As such, the sister city solidarity link between Minsk and Bangalore has not created new relations between the communities in these cities. However, while Bangalore Square never was effective in creating socialist solidarity, I missed out on this relationship that never was. Fascinated by the very idea that second and third worlds could be in solidarity against the operations of global coloniality, though they were not, I revisit Bangalore Square's solidarity moment to imagine a connection that I wish was already there. With this inquiry, I do not seek the recuperation of the past, but aim to explore what sort of a past we can refer to, rework, and how and with whom to affiliate. Bangalore Square's sister city moment may illuminate operations of imperial violence for a critique that motivates explorations of alternative feminist forms of resistance, modes of identification, and ways of collective survival, attentive to unequal power relations and place-based worldviews. I ask how this dynamic location could have been in solidarity otherwise. I deem Bangalore Square to be a trace of a possible anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist feminist relationship that seems to be a matter of the oppressive past and its corrupted utopia, but that can realign with the present otherwise and imagine solidarity into the future. In other words, I suggest aim to produce. This task requires important work of reflection on uneven power relations that precluded this solidarity in the past and rejected as a possibility today. I think such solidarities are especially important within the conditions of the post-Cold War geopolitical imaginary that maintains the erasure of anti-capitalist dissent and feeds the operations of global coloniality, manifested, for example, in racial disavowal and the rise of white supremacist groups. The explorations of socialist internationalism are often limited to macro politics, political institutions, and meta-narratives of superpowers that valorize masculine domination and/or white universality, and certain geographies of transnational solidarity that privilege imperial centers. Bangalore Square relates to the multiple and contested legacies of Soviet modernity that produced sister city solidarity between Minsk and Bangalore, but at the same time inhibited real community engagement. And yet Bangalore Square lives an active life by being built into the fabrics of urban social and political life. Within the conditions of authoritarianism in contemporary Belarus, Bangalore Square has been the only place where oppositional political protests were allowed due to its distance from the city center and the main government buildings. This marginal space serves for me also as an entry point to explore those moments and geographies of solidarity that seem marginal, failed, and unimportant. I approach this inquiry from the perspective of someone who is part of a post-socialist queer feminist political diaspora. This perspective is informed by the conditions of authoritarianism and anti-gender politics in Belarus that have created different forms of political suppression and prompted exile across national sexual borders. Importantly, my research also grew from transnational feminist activism in Belarus, from where I forged feminist relations and collaborations with activists in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, and collaboration specifically in Kyrgyzstan helped me to engage more with socialist internationalism questions and continue this exploration of alternative histories. This experience encouraged me to think against the violence of imperial powers, both Western and Russian, and the hegemonic post-Cold War forms of identification, and instead privilege community relations, special connections, and place-based networks of solidarity as fundamental sites of resistance and mutual support. Also, while I'm here in the US, I also feel the gravity of US hegemony. And here I feel also the loss of past struggles against capitalism, imperialism, and racism centered in the former Second World. At the same time, I also am aware of how the former Second World's imperial ambitions compromised socialist and left-leaning movements. In this sense, I draw on Ann Stoller's concept of vital refiguration, which offers, quote, to think differently about both the language we use to capture the tenacious hold of imperial effects and their tangible, if elusive forms, as well as the uneven temporal sedimentations in which imperial formations leave their marks, end quote. Stoller focuses on the vital refiguration of the imperial sedimentations in order, quote, to recognize that these are unfinished histories, not of a victimized past, but of consequential histories of differential futures, end quote. Bangalore Square as a sentiment of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist ethos may serve as a source of, quote, renewed collective claims as history in a spirited voice, as a site that animates both despair and new possibilities, bids for entitlement and unexpected collaborative political projects, end quote. Stoller suggests exploring such histories, quote, that emerge from tracking unrealized possibilities, arrested and failed experiments that commonly remain unmarked as proper historical events because they were never fully realized and thus were not understood to have been possible or to have happened, end quote. In this way, I strive to articulate transnational feminist solidarities in Stoller's terms that are responsive to historical roads not taken, to brazen and impossible alternatives proposed and squashed, to muted dissensions and suspended plans. Thus, looking at diverse and often marginal and hidden histories of socialist internationalism, I explore alternative anti-capitalist visions and anti-imperialist geographies of solidarity. Specifically, I explore archival accounts that document Black women's travels to the Soviet Union roughly through 1932 till 1976. On the slide, you can see some artifacts that register Black women's presence in the Soviet Union. Through their travels, such Black women as Louise Thompson Patterson, Claudia Jones, Alice Childress, Slanda Robeson, Hermina Dumont Hugheswood, and Audre Lorde influenced socialist practices, created spaces for transnational interconnectedness, and informed visions of feminist solidarity. In this way, I bring in experiences tied to proletarian internationalism, third worldism, Soviet internationalism, communist international, Black feminist internationalism, and Afro-Asian solidarity, to name just a few. Soviet internationalism was just one articulation of socialist thought on a continuum of activist struggles for social justice. So, for example, this visual aid serves the purposes to mark the plurality of socialist internationalist praxis. Many actors have engaged with diverse socialist internationalist projects. They appropriated and reworked them while also creating new practices and ideas about the collectivity and what is shared, as well as relying on place-based communal and indigenous histories. For example, Cedric Robinson underlines that while Marxism is a Western construction and the origins of socialist thought are not with the European proletariat but the middle class, he also emphasizes that before the 19th century, quote, what has sometimes been referred to as a socialist vision was a species of the moral and architectonic traditions that had penetrated European thought in the form of ethical systems and considerations preserved from the civilization of Egypt, ancient Greece, and Asia Minor, end quote. Against the orthodoxies of European left movements, Robinson foregrounds Black radical traditions that center racial capitalism in response to global coloniality and thus reclaims those traditions occluded by Eurocentrism. Black women's travels to the Soviet Union were part of the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-racist political commitments that relied heavily on their experiences of anti-Black racism in the US. Black internationalist women matured in the vibrant environment of Harlem, where the legacies of slavery and colonialism were tangible, coexisted with diverse struggles for social justice, labor upheavals, the creative ferment of the Harlem Renaissance, and the radicalism of Black liberation politics. Black women were especially affected by the economic and social injustices and encountered many forms of sexual violence rooted in long histories of exploitation of their reproductive and productive labor. Working against significant restrictions on employment and mobility, left-based activism helped Black women access resources and institutions usually foreclosed in the white supremacist and segregationist US landscape. Early on, they became interested in transnational politics. For example, in her autobiographical history, Claudia Jones writes that she joined the workforce during the years of the Ethiopian War, the invasion of Mongolia, and the Scottsboro Boys case. At that time, she also started a weekly column, Claudia's Comments, for a Harlem publication. Her, quote, job consisted there also of writing précis of the main editorial comments on Ethiopia from general commercial press, Negro rights, and trade union press, etc., end quote. She regularly followed street corner discussions led by representatives of a wide range of political opinions and became especially impressed by communist speakers, quote, who explained the reasons for this brutal crime against young Negro boys and who related the Scottsboro case to the struggle of the Ethiopian people against fascism and Mussolini's invasion, end quote. Unsurprisingly, within this context, Black internationalist women collaborated with and worked for many different leftist and communist organizations and publications and became active participants in peace and anti-colonial movements. They also started to see travel and mobility as an important practice and a political tool of liberation, as a means of moving beyond the scripts of structural injustice and forming mobile and fugitive subjectivities. I suggest that mobility became a tool for them to challenge oppressive geographies and critique, meet, share, imagine, and produce transformative spaces and experiences. Black internationalist women's mobility encompassed a movement across physical borders and a transgression across social boundaries and structural injustices. Moving geographically and epistemically, Black internationalist women constantly reflected on their own positionality and geographies while putting them in relation to the places they visited, thus opposing Cold War binaries and internationalizing the response to US anti-Black racism and imperial violence. Their mobility was a radical refusal of logics of servitude imposed on their bodies and a challenge to oppressive geographic arrangements. At the same time, their meticulous and copious notes that Black internationalist women made during their trips to the Soviet Union have value not so much for the information they hold, but because these notes demonstrate their desires, care, love, and struggle for freedom. These Black women cultivated a sense of togetherness across uneven geographies by delving in and exploring every piece of knowledge, information, experience they encountered, even under the state's gaze. Learning from each other, caring for each other, sharing the struggles of each other, and relating across differences are the modes that suggest motivated and animated Black internationalist women's trips to and engagements with the Soviet Union. For example, Louise Thompson Patterson explained her mother the significance of her trip to the Soviet Central Asia in the following way. I really feel that I have the best chance I have ever had for real study, and one which will probably never come my way again. The proposed tour is not merely for sightseeing or pleasure. We are going down to Asiatic Russia for the purpose of studying the Soviet policy for national minorities. It is really a great chance, and I hope to secure valuable data for articles and lectures upon my return to America, end quote. Also, Black women centered the lived experiences of Black women and the historical, political, and cultural context in response to which these experiences emerged. They also emphasized how this context encompassed transnational entanglements and relations. Accordingly, they traveled extensively to forge connections with marginalized and oppressed peoples abroad. Traveling to the Soviet Union, they brought unique visions on the structures of oppression while also drawing inspiration from and enriching the place they visited. They envisioned the trip to the Soviet Union as a part of a transnational movement of people of color united in a struggle against the colonial, imperialist, and capitalist domination of the West. Thus, in her essay called Visit to the USSR and published in the West Indian Gazette in 1962, Claudia Jones underlined, quote, I wanted to see for myself the first land of socialism, to meet its people, to see for myself the growth of its society, its culture, its technological and scientific advance. I was curious to see a land which I already knew abhorred racial discrimination to the extent of making it a legal crime and where the equality of all people is a recognized axiom, end quote. In turn, Alice Childress emphasized how the trip to the Soviet Union was an important part of her thinking about practices and politics at home. Quote, everything we see and do is important to us only in the taking back to those at home, to those who may never see the face of socialism. We of African descent, struggling for our rights the world over, ask questions which stem from our deep hunger and need to know about ourselves and our chances all over the globe. When we return, we will be asked very predictable questions. Are they interested in us? Do they know anything about us? Are there any blacks living there? Is there any prejudice against darker peoples? Do the minorities of the Soviet Union have special problems as we do in the United States, end quote. Similarly, Thompson Patterson wrote in her unpublished memoirs about her 1932 trip, quote, what I had witnessed, especially in Central Asia, convinced me that only a new social order could remedy the American racial injustices I knew so well. I went to the Soviet Union with leftist leanings. I returned home a committed revolutionary, end quote. Inspired by the Soviet encounters, Black internationalist women hoped to return home with a new sense of determination to mobilize communities against structural oppressions. For instance, after her trip to the Soviet Union, Louise Thompson Patterson became more politically involved and traveled extensively domestically and abroad. Thus, she became especially active with the Scottsboro case, as she attended several demonstrations in the Soviet Union in defense of Black men. In May 1933, just a year after her return, or just a couple of months probably after her return from the Soviet Union, she organized the Free the Scottsboro Boys March in Washington, D.C. In 1936, she published an article, Toward a Brighter Dawn, that described Black women as the most exploited group within the US working class. Specifically, this article portrayed Black women as oppressed by racism, while also bearing the sole responsibility for reproductive work and suffering most from the persistent economic crisis. Thompson Patterson noted that Black female subjects experienced triple oppression along the lines of class, gender, and race. Black women also inquired, like Childress, what possibilities for solidarity could exist between uneven geographies. Therefore, they also forged relations with Soviet communities and practices, trying to understand their significance. Unsurprisingly, many of Black internationalist women were especially interested in visiting Central Asia. Specifically, many of them traveled to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Soviet officials envisioned Central Asia as a perfect ground for mediating alliances with third world struggles. Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, at that time the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, became a primary location for Afro-Asian solidarity. Since the 1920s, Tashkent had functioned as an exemplary city of successful decolonization, and hence was a common destination for international delegations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. For example, in 1970 until 1939, Indian revolutionaries considered Tashkent as a place where they could escape British imperial violence, cultivate new visions of political protest, and collaborate with each other and with local communities. Nevertheless, this positioning of Tashkent as an exemplary city was still interconnected with Soviet imperial narratives in relation to Central Asia. For instance, Rasen Zhigalov critically ruminates about the role of local communities in Afro-Asian solidarity events, whose, quote, non-white bodies were meant to represent an ethnically and racially diverse Soviet Union and dispel the lingering suspicion of many African, Asian, and Latin American cultural producers that the USSR was just another white empire, end quote. Similarly, much earlier, Langston Hughes, who visited Soviet Central Asia in 1932, noted in his letter to Matt Crawford that he experienced difficulties making connections with local communities in Central Asia. Quote, "The great difficulty here is getting in touch with the native life. The Turkmens sort of step aside and let the Russians take charge of all the visitors," end quote. Black radical women probably also could have encountered multiple difficulties to forge connections, but also could have neglected the fact that the Soviet Union achieved much of its progress through violence, exploitation, and the denigration of indigenous life forms. However, I suggest that they could have offered alternative readings of Soviet practices, trying to connect to local communities and their struggles. Following the gravitational pull of revolutionary ideas, many of them attempted to reinterpret and assign their own meanings to Soviet politics and practices. The critique of state power and its colonial gaze has immense significance, yet risks overshadowing alternative stories that might have existed beyond the operations of state machinery. Thus, Zhigalov notes that participating in Afro-Asian events in Tashkent, artists and writers produced special practices that resisted prescriptive norms of whose bodies can travel and produce knowledge and whose bodies are not capable of knowledge production and hence must be held in suspension. Afro-Asian events also contributed to decentering traditional Western geography and establishing direct South-to-South relations and solidarities. Through informal exchanges and interactions with local spaces and peoples, foreign participants, together with local communities, produced other ethics of connection and ecologies of knowledge unalienable from reflections about global capitalism and racial modernity. In this way, Tashkent linked official politics of performative solidarity with intimacies of radical solidarity. Unsurprisingly, Black women envisioned their trips to the Soviet Union as a part of global solidarity with people of color. In this way, they also privileged alternative geographies. Thus, in 1976, Audre Lorde participated in the Afro-Asian Young Writers Conference in Tashkent. Although the institutions of Afro-Asian solidarity mediated by the Soviet Union opened the possibility for Lorde to travel to Tashkent, she forged relations with this location beyond the formal political realm, prioritizing the special and embodied dimension of her experience on the ground. Audre Lorde notes, quote, "If Moscow is New York, Tashkent is Accra," referring to Ghana, end quote. And quote, "The people feel so Western European, so American really outside of Tashkent," end quote. She also notes, quote, "So off the hotel we went and I had the distinct feeling here for the first time in Russia that I was meeting warm-blooded people in the sense of contact unavoided, desires and emotions possible, the sense that there was something hauntingly personally familiar, not in the way the town looks because it looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, night and minarets, but the tempo of life felt hotter, quicker than in Moscow, and in place of Moscow's determined pleasantness, the people displayed a kind of warmth that was very engaging." In this quote, one could see that it was a space of desires and emotions possible that allowed Lorde to engage with peoples and forge contact unavoided. Lorde searched for connections reflected not in concrete categories and similarities, but in something hauntingly personally familiar that unfolded registers of relationality, where a kind of warmth that was very engaging was put at the core. In her notes, Lorde highlights how public spaces in Tashkent preserved diverse political, social, and cultural legacies. Different imperial forces, histories, and experiences of domination and resistance are implicated in the production of Tashkent, its possibilities, and its limitations. It was this multimodality of the public space and the durability of different imperial and colonial histories that reminded Lorde of the landscapes of Ghana. For instance, while describing the advancements of Soviet material infrastructure in Tashkent, Lorde also notices spaces of collective communal interaction. Quote, "We passed through small villages where I could see little markets with women sitting cross-ankled on the bare earth, selling a few cabbages or a small tray of fruit," end quote. And in another part, she writes, quote, "Each town that we pass through has a cafe where the villagers can come and spend an evening or chat or talk or watch TV or listen to propaganda, who knows, but where they can meet," end quote. Lorde focuses on small acts, fleeting encounters, and special arrangements that constitute the experience of inhabiting public space. Her vision doesn't relegate local communities to an isolated past. Neither she sees the Soviet Union through the prism of homogeneity or imperial totality. Non-Slavic, non-European indigenous communities in the Soviet Union were not just passive recipients of Soviet orders, but actively redressed, reappropriated, and produced transformative practices and imaginaries. Soviet policies and practices generated their own racial and ethnic hierarchies and pressures. They included the production of racialized gender difference, exploitation of labor, alienated from the land and previous life worlds and relations, and appropriation of land at the expense of the destruction of communal relations and pre-modern engagements with land production and exchange. Unsurprisingly, Lorde emphasizes that without a more robust analysis of the practices of colonization, racialization, quote, "Socialism remains at the mercy of an incomplete vision imposed from the outside," end quote. Similarly, for example, in her speech at the 25th Congress of the Communist Party of Britain in 1957, Claudia Jones critiqued white communists for how they reproduced imperialist logics in regard to non-European contexts. Quote, "Nor is an eternal immunity from distrust by colonial peoples won merely by constant reference to our past record, no matter how glorious that record may be. One should learn to be modest and learn something from the experience of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that big nation chauvinism doesn't automatically die even after the achievement of socialism," end quote. Critical of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, she suggested the necessity to fight against great nation chauvinism in order to challenge racial capitalism and the legacies of imperialism. Yet Jones emphasized that marginal struggles of oppressed peoples, including peoples in the Soviet Union, may produce an actual rupture in these imperial logics. Black internationalist women foregrounded the uniqueness of anti-Black violence, as well as insisted that it is possible to connect this violence to those experienced by other racialized, gendered, devalued peoples. Black women challenged the nation state as an exclusive framework and underscored international connections of non-state actors. In this way, I focus on the quotidian and intimate textures of the solidarity moments rather than on the solidified structures and stable characteristics of institutions and meta-narratives. I center fleeting encounters, moments of travel, places of care, and envision accountability as a part of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist feminist praxis ingrained in a dynamic of daily life. For example, Lord describes a meeting with a woman in Gulistan, approximately 100 kilometers southwest of Tashkent, who offered her food and a place to stay and rest. Describing the meeting, Lord prioritized moments of friendship and intimate encounter before tropes of official interaction. I'll quote, "I will never know the name of the very kind young woman who opened her home to me, but I also will not forget her. She offered me the hospitality of her house, and even though we didn't speak the same language, I felt that she was a woman like myself, wishing that all of our children could live in peace upon their own earth, somehow make fruitful the power of their own hands." Through Helen, she spoke about her 3 children, one of whom was only a nursing infant, and I spoke of my 2. I spoke in English and she spoke in Russian, but I felt very strongly that our hearts spoke the same tongue. End quote. This intimate relation produces alternative forms of sociality and futurity. Lord interacted with a woman like myself, linking caring with a shared vision of a livable future where all of our children could live in peace upon their own earth, somehow make fruitful the power of their own hands. This moment of intimate and compassionate connection between a US-born woman of Afro-Caribbean heritage and Soviet Uzbek woman embraces practices of solidarity and friendship that center communal survival and the resilience of indigenous life worlds. I approach solidarity as a juncture, a coming together, or a connection whereby there is a possibility for change. This definition encompasses both the concrete solidarities where coming together is possible, and the imagined ones, where a relationship has all conditions to emerge, but for some reason wouldn't. The reclamation of internationalist solidarities between the struggling women of color opens up theoretical and methodological possibilities for current thinking about the interconnected issues of freedom, power, race, gender, class, and the ongoing need for social change globally. These internationalist solidarities locate Eurasia as a part of the global alongside rethinking the forms of transnational feminist protest and activism, both in the United States and the former Second World. I suggest that internationalist solidarities challenge the genealogies of current landscapes of feminist theory and might expand thinking about non-hegemonic transnational solidarities against capitalism, heteropatriarchy, racism, and imperialism. With this project, I reveal prospects for contemporary efforts to create transnational feminist networks in response to the effects of globalization and build interdisciplinary bridges between critical race studies, transatlantic Black intellectual traditions, transnational feminism, and post-socialist studies. My project searches for such forms of thinking that disrupt the totalizing logic of racial capitalism and cultivate other ways of knowing and understanding the world by learning and relating across differences. I'm convinced that the exchanges between Black women and Eurasian communities produce new avenues for transnational solidarity and eliminate omitted dimensions of anti-racist praxis attuned to global structures of inequality and exclusion. Thank you very much